New Philanthropy Capital.
A very warm welcome to everyone who is joining us today. It's great to see so many people interested in what is a very important topic facing so many boards. As a governor of a school myself, I know I've been talking about the cost of living crisis at our board meetings for the best part of a year now, and I'm sure many of you have been thinking about this in different ways. I'm Angela Kale. I'm the Director of Consulting here at NPC, and I lead NPC's work on the cost of living crisis. And I am pleased to be joined today by three fantastic speakers who will share their own perspectives and their own thoughts on the subject. So we have Dulcie McBride, who is chair of the Wild Young Parents Project in Cornwall. Wild provides support to the whole family through a range of services. Then we will hear from Peter Cheese, who is chair of the What Works Centre for Wellbeing. And lastly, we will hear from Connie Cullen, a trustee at Praxis, a charity which supports migrants and refugees in London. We'll hear from each of them in turn, and then we'll have time to answer your questions, and then we'll move to discussion between all of the speakers. So before we get started, some housekeeping. This is a free public webinar open to all, and there may be some journalists present. We will be recording the session, including any questions that you ask, and it will be available to watch online by you and others after the event. If you are a tweeter, we encourage you to use the hashtag NPC trusteeship so that others can join the conversation. And please do ask questions throughout the session using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We will be collating these and asking as many as possible in the second half of the session, after the panelists have shared their initial thoughts. We are really grateful to the Clothworkers Company for making it possible to put on this event for free to attendees. The Clothworkers have been supporting these trustees seminars for many years, and without their support, they would not be possible. So we have been hearing a lot about the cost of living crisis, which I have described as a boiling frog crisis, something where the temperature has been raised for such a long time, and often it can feel like it's too late by the time you notice how serious a problem it is. At NPC, we have been working on this for a while. In June last year, we published our guidance for philanthropists on what they could be doing. And we've been following up with various media, blogs, and events, including this one, on the cost of living crisis. And one thing that I always say is that unlike when we are talking about the impact on businesses or on individuals, for charities, there are really three ways the cost of living crisis is hitting them. So firstly, and perhaps most worryingly, demand is going up. Trussell Trust says that need at its food banks is as high as it was during the pandemic. 1 in 4 users of care are in debt. And imagine having to pay for personal care and also being worried about debt levels. So it's perhaps no surprise that Mind is also reporting that mental health problems are increasing. The second way it's affecting organisations is that inflation is hitting the organisations themselves. Staffing costs are under pressure, meaning that there are vacancies for staff while they're having to deal with higher demand. Travel costs are going up, which affects volunteers and those who are working more rurally. And energy costs are going up, which is difficult in particular for those charities who have accommodation costs. One charity told me that their energy bill was going to be £500,000 higher this year, which is greatly affected by the third way that it's hitting charities, which is that fundraising is more difficult. Fewer people are giving, and those people are giving less. The cost of living crisis is exacerbating a long-term trend in fundraising. Charities that rely on donations of stuff rather than money have also reported that they are seeing less donations as people are trying to sell stuff rather than donate it. And linked to that, fewer people can afford to volunteer. Instead, they're having to try and get a second job. So volunteering is taking a hit. All of this comes off the back of the COVID crisis, and many staff are tired after that crisis. So there was a lot of work here for trustees to think about in managing this crisis, both in terms of whether they can keep the lights on and meet the need in their ongoing work, or whether they need to change their own strategy, as needs have changed so much. So, Dulcie, I'm going to go to you first. I know your organisation has done a lot of thinking about the cost of living crisis. And Dulcie McBride is chair of the Wild Young Parents Project in Cornwall, which provides support to mums, dads and their children, and I'm sure has a lot of thoughts on what can be done here. So, Dulcie, over to you.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you for asking me to be part of the webinar. Yeah, so hello, my name is Dulcie. I am the chair of Wild Young Parents Project. Just in case anyone doesn't know why there is a charity for young parents, young parents are far more at risk of mental health problems, of domestic abuse, of intergenerational trauma, and therefore their children are far more at risk of poor development and kind of repeating those cycles of intergenerational trauma and violence and abuse. So that's why the charity exists. It's the largest young parents charity in the country. Well, it was last time I checked, but I think it still is. We have a turnover of about £1 million a year. So we're not enormous, but we're not tiny. Oh, there we go. Thank you very much. Oh, next slide, please. Sorry, I got me
You have to do the Chris Whitty.
There we go. Great, thank you. And what the chief exec of our charity was saying, she went to a King's Fund event, I think it was, and I think there was lots of people there who were chief execs and chairs of charities, and they described what was happening as the triple whammy, which is kind of what Angela was just sort of saying, that we've got decrease in income, increasing costs across the board, and increasing need, and certainly here expected to pick up more need and help more people. So these are the three principles that we've kind of thought about in terms of what we might do. I would love to say that we sat down and go, what are the three principles we really ought to be doing? But these are just kind of what I came up with when I've been looking through and thinking about what we've done. And it sort of fits into these three principles. So it's about coordinating responses, building on the relationships that you have or that you want to form, and sharing the good stuff. So I was just going to talk about kind of the three areas about how we've tried to help families, helping staff, and then the organisation as well. So if we go on to the families slide. So we first started a cost of living working group, which was mostly people from Wild, but also people from other charities, because we'd set up during COVID, as I'm sure most people did, sort of alliances, collaborations of voluntary sector organisations. And those relationships were still there. So it was quite, I was going to say easy. It was a bit more straightforward than it could have been to kind of bring that group together again, even to think about the cost of living. And it was helpful because everyone was trying to find out the same information. Everyone was thinking about what do we do. So it was a way of sharing out responsibility. So I don't know whether you have these where you are, but in the voluntary sector in Cornwall, there are already alliances set up, again, off the back of COVID, around food, advice, housing. There are others, but what we did was made sure that there was someone from Wild or that group that were part of each of these county-wide alliances, partly to know what was available and how to access it, and also to link in with local campaigns. So stuff like the food alliance, so there was part of it about knowing what was available, but what we also did was made sure that we could link specific families to a food bank. Because if you're 16 and you've got a baby, turning up to a food bank can be quite daunting. So it's like, we've got this family turning up, can you look out for them? So there was that individual work as well as generally what was available at food banks. And then also understanding kind of place-based stuff, because it wasn't just food banks, there were all kinds of organisations that are set up around here to kind of distribute food more locally at a place base. And And then the other key bit we do quite a lot of work with citizens advice in Cornwall, and we still do have a formal agreement in place for priority advice for young parents. So that's formal agreement between the two charities. So I think that's pretty much what we've done with families around the kind of the knowing what's available. There is a lot of stuff out there, but it's knowing where there is. So the government are giving lots of grants to local authority, but knowing how to tap into them and saying, we're here, we can give out some of this money, like the household support grant. Children in Need are giving out money. We've got the Cornwall Community Foundation, and I guess there's community foundations elsewhere that have crisis budgets. So it's just knowing what's available and being able to tap into those resources. So we've given out supermarket vouchers, there was infant formula funding from the council, energy top-ups, data top-ups, and we've had donations from people. So we had a big donation of slow cookers that we give out. So it really is making those connections, no matter how small they seem, that you can just kind of bring together that's free. And people that have these budgets want to give them to charities to give out. So that was a key bit as well. I think that's it with families. So yeah, we go on to the staff. Brilliant, thank you. So a lot of our staff work very part-time, and although we pay the living wage, when they only work a few hours a week because they're juggling work with their own childcare, they don't earn a lot. So we decided to give everyone a pay rise. We use the JNC pay body who recommend pay rises, and that's been about 1% to 2% over the last few years. But this year we've given everyone £1,900. So obviously that is a greater percentage to those on the lowest income. We've done that because we had some extra reserves. So we were lucky that we had extra money that we could do that with. Obviously it's only a one-off this year to use the reserves, but that's how we managed to do it. We've said everyone can work from home, so reduces travel costs, although if people want to come into the office they can. We've moved to paying travel from home. If anyone's ever been to Cornwall, it's pretty spread out, so paying travel from home rather than the office is what we were doing before has helped. We've been a lot more flexible on expenses. We used to just pay with salaries at the end of the month, and now people can either claim as they go weekly, or we can give people a kind of a kitty, a pot at the beginning of the month to use throughout the month. We've used support from other VCSE organisations. So other organisations get the household support grant. We can't give our own staff the household support grant because that's for our client group, but there are other charities who get it, who our workers are their client group. So it's just linking in and thinking about which voluntary sector organisations could help our staff. We already have staff that give benefit advice to our clients. So what they've set up is confidential advice sessions for the staff ourselves, just to make sure people are maximising the benefits they're entitled to. And we've had for a while now, for about 18 months, external supervision about the practice and the work that our staff do with clients, but we've said, please use that to talk about any personal issues or any issues you've got with money or income or whatever. Use those sessions for that. It doesn't just have to be about work. I think that was all I was going to say about the staff. Yeah, that was it. So, and then the organisation. So, as we said, we've got increasing costs, increasing demand. So what we've done, and most funders have been up for this, is negotiate with funders and say, and so some have put an uplift on, which has been great, and some we've said, you must know that the costs are going up. Can we rethink what we're using our money for, or decrease our spend in some areas? So we might have to decrease delivery in some areas, but that means that we can at least keep going in these other areas, and just negotiate with them about how we actually use the money that they're giving us. This is what the chief exec said. She said when she's talking to other people, it's like, ask for help. Don't pretend you're doing well if you're not, because if everyone else is going, oh no, we're absolutely fine, then other people feel, oh, we can't say that we're not doing very well because everyone else is fine. Be honest about things not going well, and be part of bigger things. So we try to be part of all the alliances as much as we can, to know what's going on, to get involved with things that the council run and be kind of the voice of the voluntary sector, or at least part of the voluntary sector, so that you really understand what's happening and be part of bigger campaigns. So I know that the King's Fund is running an inequalities group so that we can try and lobby national funders to say, can you rethink how you're actually giving out grants and the expectations of those grants? And I think that was it. That probably isn't my 15 minutes, is it? But anyway, we're running late. So I just kind of thought I would, oh yeah, sorry, that was it. I knew there was another one. Thank you. Role of trustees. Yeah, it's because I'm not running my own slides. So yeah, so then the question was, so what can the trustees do? So my first thought was being really clear on, which I know we should do anyway, but be really clear on finances and what's possible. What do your reserves look like? What's possible? We are currently in deficit, but we balance kind of going into deficit now with we've got a lot of bids in that we think will come to fruition. So it's balancing that risk of going into deficit now, but thinking you'll be able to replenish that with new bids. Again, find out what's going on locally, use the expertise of the trustees. I very luckily work for Cornwall Council, and so I do find out what's going on. But that's the kind of the knowledge that, although I share with Wild, with part of these alliances across the sector, we share. We don't kind of keep it to ourselves. Go, don't tell anyone there's a household support grant. We share what's available and tell people at the council, oh, you want to tap into these other voluntary sector organisations because they can get to populations that you might not. Be part of either your voluntary sector forum or CVS. Find out what's available nationally. Our chief exec is very plugged into national stuff, but there's no reason why trustees can't do the research to find out what's available nationally. So from NCVO or the government or the big national funders. Join or create alliances and build new relationships or build on relationships. So I think these kind of webinars are good to kind of help people kind of get the same understanding, and you can do that locally. Again, a lot of our alliances are through people that work in the charity sector, but there's no reason why trustees can't start alliances themselves and join them if capacity is tight with the people that work for the charity. And again, negotiate with the funders. There's no reason why trustees can't do it. We don't have to leave it to the chief execs and the bid writers to do that. We should get involved as well. So those were just my thoughts. I think that is it now.
Well, those were great thoughts. Please do use the Q&A function if you have any questions in particular for Dulcie. One, it was great to see that your sort of three ways this affects in the charity sector were the same as mine. It's always good to have that sort of confirmation. But I suppose I'm particularly interested in the negotiate with funders, and I know lots of people on the call would be as well. Would you mind going into a little bit more detail on that? Sort of what sort of funders? Are they local authorities? Are they government bodies? Are they sort of trusts and foundations? And how have you found those negotiations going?
I think, well, most of our funding we have quite a bit from the local authority through a number of different commissioning pots. It's not just one, and then sort of the big funders like Children in Need, Comic Relief. So I mean, it depends. It's all comes down to relationships. We have a very good relationship with our local authority commissioners, and they think Wild's fabulous, which is also very helpful. So when we say we are really struggling, this is the level of need that we're seeing, and of course they're seeing it as well. We need to change what we do. They've been pretty amenable to us changing things, and as a charity, quite a lot of the senior team do put a lot of time into helping the local authority think through how they work with the voluntary sector. So we have good relationships there. So when we say we're in trouble, they take that seriously and can change it. And I think the big national funders have been quite useful as well. So it was Comic Relief and I think Children in Need that have given what they called they've given an uplift of a percentage. I think some are less keen to readjust what we said we would deliver on and kind of the outcomes and outputs. but some are amenable, and it's knowing, again, it's the relationships you have with kind of their local representatives and local kind of the people that you know, to actually kind of use the relationships that you have with the local funding people to say, come on, you know what's happening, how do we do the best. And I'm basing it on, everyone wants to try and do the best for the people that we serve. We're not trying to fiddle the books, or take money that we're not entitled to. This is generally going, this is really, really hard. How do we collectively try and do the best for the people that we're trying to serve? And in the main, most people have some wriggle room on that.
Very nice pushing of that collective message again, which I think is really important in these times. There's another question coming in before we move to Peter. So someone's asked about whether there's a central mailing list or resource to hear from central government about funding streams available to charities, or is that about working with the CVS to get them to flag them to you? How do you do that?
I don't know if there's a central mailing list. If there is, I'm not on it. I think a lot of the government funding has come through local government. So if you have contacts in local government, that's certainly where I've got my information from in terms of what the central government pots are. And then, our local VSF puts out a weekly newsletter which has funding streams. But I wouldn't, I don't think it's not a neat and tidy comprehensive list of everything central government's doing. It is trying to work it out from different bits and people that we know and contacts in local government.
And isn't that one of the problems of the charity sector, that everything is trying to work out bits and pieces and figure out where you should go? Thank you so much, Dulcie. We'll come back to you when we come back to the sort of questions for everyone at the end. But now we're going to talk to Peter. So Peter, as well as being the chair of the What Works Centre for Wellbeing, you're also the CEO of the Chartered Institute for Personnel and Development. So I'm sure lots of the issues that Dulcie was talking about there in terms of staff really resonate with you, and you've been giving this quite a lot of thought. So over to you.
Yeah, no, thanks, Angela, and it's great to be part of this webinar. We can probably take the slide down, otherwise I'm going to be staring at what my title is for the next 10 minutes. No, great to be part of this. As you said, I sort of have a day job as Chief Executive of the CIPD, so professional body for HR and people development. And of course, these issues around cost of living increases and pay and everything else are a huge part of what we are researching. So share some insights on that. But interestingly, the CIPD itself is a charity, which just illustrates the very big range in which charities operate. But I also chair the What Works Centre for Wellbeing, which kind of does what it says on the tin. Great privilege to chair that group. Dan Corrie from NPC is on that board as well. So I think that's where some of the connection was made to be part of this webinar. But as you said, I mean, first and foremost, we are in an extraordinary period of time. We've got cost of living increases, the likes of which we haven't seen for decades. That is causing other things like industrial action, which we haven't seen for decades. We have a huge amount of economic uncertainty, so it's very hard to see where this is leading. I know it's one of the Prime Minister's top 5 priorities to get inflation down, and there are signs that it's probably peaked. But there's still a big knock-on effect of cost of living gaps arising everywhere. And of course, many people pointing out that pay in so many jobs and sectors has not kept pace with cost of living historically, and then the gap suddenly becomes very, very large. We also have right across the workforce many challenges in terms of skills gaps. A lot of talk about things like attraction and retention of talent. You will have heard of quotes, although frankly they're sort of rather media friendly quotes, like the great resignation and quiet quitting and all of that kind of stuff. And I'll come back to a couple of those thoughts because they are quite important. So we are in these extraordinary times, and of course for charities it can be tougher. They're not uniquely facing these challenges, but when you look at the average pay increases, for example, being given across, say, private sector versus public sector and third sector, private sector averaging around 7 to 8%, public sector and third sector more like 3 to 4%. So there's a disparity there. But what we also know, of course, in all of this is it's not just about pay. People don't come and work for organizations just because they may or may not get paid significant sums of money. we have learned an awful lot in recent years, and much more focus on ideas like purpose, which charities can really exemplify very strongly, and particularly the younger generations coming into work are very driven by ideas like, yeah, but what's the point of this business beyond making money? What is its purpose? How is this organization doing good for society or for the wider world? They're a lot more aware of the many crises that we're in. It's not just economic crises, we have environmental crises and political crises and other things. And I think many people want to feel that whatever they are doing is contributing to some of these big agendas. So purpose has become talked about a great deal more. And that is, to me, always one of the things that has distinguished charities from private sector, is that people identify very much with the purpose of the charity, and it's a very, very clear thing that drives them in ways that is not always so apparent in commercial enterprises. But more broadly, this discussion about employee value propositions, what is it therefore that attracts and retains people? So yes, of course, we're looking at pay, and pay is often being divided into what I can add to people's pay, so how much I might increase their pay during the year, but also what's called non-consolidated payments, a single one-off payments where you're not consolidating into their base pay. So you're not therefore setting a long-term precedent in terms of pay increase, because things can and will change. The reason why pay in all of this debate is so important, particularly in charities, is because it makes up the vast majority of our costs. We have other costs, of course, operating costs, which were being affected by energy costs and costs of rent and other things that are our operating costs in businesses. But still, typically in charities, the biggest cost is around people. So what we're also seeing, therefore, is other ways in which we attract and retain people. I talked about purpose as a sort of wider idea. But given some of the parameters in which we are typically operating, we can't meet all of the cost of living increase just by pay. So what are some of the elements that I think every organization has to consider around their people and their resources? Now, first of all, related to the employee value proposition are things like flexible working. Now, flexible working, I've always been a proponent of. The pandemic has catalyzed it hugely. We know it's a very big attractor for people, and indeed in all our research about what is it that attracts people into jobs and what do they ask about after they've asked about pay, they're usually asking about flexible working. But interestingly, the other thing that's appearing more and more in the top three is do they believe that the workplace they're coming into is inclusive in all that means, and that they can operate in an environment where they're respected and we respect difference, where we take care of our people, we have a safe culture where people can speak up, and that we're bringing together all the skills and talents and capabilities and are working in organizations, therefore, that reflect the societies of which we are part. So that's really gone up the agenda a lot, and then links into things that you mentioned, Angela, around ideas like well-being. Yeah, because well-being is such an important issue, and you're absolutely right when you said that over the course of recent years, and again accelerated through the pandemic and now into all the tougher times that we're facing at the moment and the uncertainty, then things like mental health and well-being has become a very strong theme for all businesses to focus on, and people are looking for that sort of support. So when we talk about both how we retain our people, but also how we attract people, it's a lot more of these dimensions now that we need to be a lot more transparent about, talking about them as core values to our organization and how we deliver on things like inclusive cultures and safe cultures, and how we support the well-being of our people and not just overload them with work. But with all of that said, of course, businesses are also looking at, well, do I have to go through some restructuring? Do I have to really look at how efficiently and effectively we're using our resources? Because in many cases, we're not always using our resources in the most efficient way. So what are the ways in which we can perhaps think about that and our productivity and outcomes of that nature? So there's a lot more discussion of those things as well, and operating models. And certainly the charities I've been involved with, including the What Works Centre, to Dulcie's point, we're very realistic about where we are, and in the case of the What Works Centre, financially it's pretty challenging. Some of the pre-existing funding sources we had have largely dissipated or changed their form very significantly. So we have to look at things like the structure of the organisation, about Can we resource slightly differently? Can we partner with others perhaps? And those much more strategic options, which we can come back to, but have to be part of the bigger picture that we're talking about. But we're also talking about all these aspects, as I said, of what it means to work in an organization, what attracts people, what is a good job, how we major on ideas like purpose. And it's fascinating to me to see organizations like the What Works Centre, which doesn't have a lot of financial resources, is not paying top dollar by any stretch of the imagination, but is still able to attract very capable people who have a very, very strong belief in that purpose. And I think we sometimes forget just how powerful that is, as I said, particularly in the world that we're living in at the moment, and the desires and attitudes of young people towards work in particular, but not uniquely to young people, but I think more with young people in Gen Y and Gen Z, as we often refer to them now, than we've seen in the past. So those were things that I would just wanted to sort of put into the mix of the debate. I think, finally, I would say that I think we're at an inflection point in many ways in which we think about work. And flexible working is an example of that. But how all businesses look at their purpose, as I've touched on, how we create good jobs which are meaningful for people, and how we make sure that businesses are stepping up and showing that they can act responsibly in all of these regards. Whether we're going to get, or how we get through this cost of living crisis, what's going to happen with inflation, this is going to be with us for some time. I think, if we're sitting here with hoping we can just batten down the hatches and it'll all disappear and then it'll be fine in 6 months, I don't think it's going to happen. We already have a lot of inbuilt inflation into many of our supply costs and our staff costs, and they're not going to come down. Unfortunately, generally speaking, it doesn't matter what cost you look at, once they go up, they tend to stay up. So we have to get our heads around operating in this slightly different context. But as I said, I think there are many things that we can do, and we should be challenging our organizations to think about beyond just, well, have I got to pay people more in order to attract and retain?
That's great, Peter. Thank you. And I think the point you make about flexible working is really interesting, both because for pre-pandemic, flexible work in the charity sector was one of the reasons why people joined us, because they could work from home, they could work part-time, and now that's the norm everywhere. So we don't have that carrot. But someone made a comment in the chat, which I'd be interested in your views on, which is, how does flexible working work if you are a frontline worker, as opposed to in an office space? Like, what is much harder to put in place there, and what are the things that organizations can think about?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I'd say to point out about flexible working is, yes, I absolutely recognize charities have tended to be better at more flexible ways of working than most. It still remains a very strong draw and attractor, and we should keep promoting that. And I would add one other dimension to it, which is the flexibility of being able to recruit people from very different geographies. I mean, Dulcie's on the call from Cornwall. I remember in the height of the pandemic, we put out some research, and I was doing a lot of calls with local radio. And I remember doing one with BBC Cornwall, and they were saying, yeah, we've noticed more people moving down to Cornwall and saying, you know what, I can have the best of both. I can live in Cornwall and still work for an organization based somewhere else. So that's another dimension of how we can think about flexible working. But to answer the question, the first thing I would say is that flexible working is not just about hybrid working. Of course, the media attention has been very, very focused on working from home, because that has probably been one of the biggest seismic shifts. A lot more people saying, this is great, I can work more from home than I had, and getting that hybrid working, as is often described. But exactly to Stephen's point, we know that most workforces, and indeed across the working population, there are more people who work in jobs that require you to be in a place of work. So how do you make it fair? If I've got some office workers can work partly from home, and so how do I make it fair? So what is flexible working? Well, flexible working is my hours, my schedules, my shift patterns, working part-time. All those sorts of things are part of flexible working. And they are very much things that we can promote and support in charities in the ways that we've already touched on. So just think about flexible working in the round. It's all these different other dynamics. I mean, we're even experimenting in the CIPD at the moment, just trialing ideas of 4-day working weeks, which has been quite a lot of attention in the media about. Whether that'll work, I don't know, because it's a really interesting idea, but we have to be clear on what we're expecting it to be. It's the 100-80-100 model. So 100% of the pay, 80% of the time, 100% of the output. And the reality is one of the things we have to change to make sure that flexible working really works in all these contexts is we better understand the output and outcomes of what people are doing. And that we then, on top of that, train our managers far better to manage people who are working these different ways. And it's been a soapbox of mine for many, many years that we have not done a good enough job in most organizations in training managers how to look after people, how to understand, particularly in a world where their teams are more diverse and all the different diversity characteristics we talk about are now working in lots of different ways. We have got to train them better to really deliver on these sorts of things. And as I said, in particular, therefore, in encouraging flexible working in all its forms, that they can judge people much more by what they produce and the outputs and the outcomes, and not by how many hours they might be sat in front of a computer screen or driving around or whatever aspect of their job that we've typically measured in the past. So not just inputs, but real outputs. And that is a challenge, I think, for businesses everywhere.
Well, there's a lot there for everyone to think about in terms of some of the things you can do around your staffing in order to sort of combat the pressures that organisations are seeing from the cost of living crisis. Thank you very much, Peter. And we'll come back to you after we've heard from Connie. So Connie Cullen is a trustee at Praxis, which is a charity which supports migrants and refugees in London. So I am sure that is a charity where you are seeing a lot of the brunt of the cost of living crisis on some people who are most in need. So Connie, we're really interested to hear your thoughts on this.
Thanks, Angela. Hi, everyone. So yeah, I'm Connie. I'm a trustee at Praxis. We work with migrants and refugees, and I've prepared a presentation, but I've just tried to share it, and it says that I can't share presentations here. So I don't know if someone could put my slides up, perhaps, if I send them to someone. Is that possible, Angela?
I've just given you permission. You should be able to share now.
Yeah. Great, thank you. Now let me know when you can see that.
We can see that, but it might be worth making it full screen.
Yeah, I'm just trying to. Is it coming? Yeah.
That's your view. If you can
change how can I make it? Sorry. I'm not sure because I'm sharing my screen if it will always do that. Let me just see.
You go down to the bottom right-hand side of yours, of the PowerPoint.
Yeah.
It might be the little button.
It's still giving me my view. So does that work for everyone? And I can just,
I think,
see it?
Let's go with that. I think it's easy enough to see, yeah.
Good. As I said, I'm Connie, I'm a trustee of Praxis, and I just wanted to say a quick bit about who Praxis are. So we support migrants and refugees, and what we want is a world where people aren't defined by their immigration status and people are treated with dignity and respect. We're one of the leading voices for migrants' rights in the UK. We are London-based, and most of the kind of direct service delivery work that we do is in London. But in terms of the policy, the campaigns work that we do, that's all national. So we use the evidence that we gather through our services in order to call for systemic change. So we provide kind of expert support to migrants and refugees, around 2,000 people a year. And it's a combination of immigration advice, which is one of our sort of core offers, housing support, peer support groups. So the other kind of pillar that Praxis stands on is service user involvement, and it's very, very embedded in how Praxis works. So they're called groups. So there are groups who exist within Praxis of people who have lived experience of the issues that we talk about, and who run campaigns, part of the board, do different things in terms of the kind of workings of the charity, and that's a really critical part of what we do. So I wanted next just to talk about, I think my screen's taking a long time to update. So the next thing that I wanted to talk about is the cost of living crisis specifically as it's affecting migrants. So I know the cost of living crisis obviously affects all of us, but for people who've migrated to the UK, there are a number of additional challenges that mean they're particularly vulnerable. So firstly, migrants are more likely to be in low paid and insecure work than the general population and face a disproportionate risk of destitution. Around 1.3 million migrants are barred from accessing what we call the social safety net, essentially benefits, kind of public services that most of us take for granted in our lives, including the NHS. So that's even if they've lived here for a long time, and even if they themselves are working and paying taxes, they may still have this no recourse condition which bars them from accessing those safety net. Then there's the specifics of the Home Office processes that people are subject to. So they are required to reapply for leave to remain every 30 months. And the Home Office take on average at the moment around 11 months to process applications. So for those 11 months, you may have no documented status. And I'm sure we all know as employers now, in order to get a job or to keep a job, you need to be able to prove your right to remain in the UK, and your that can be very, very difficult if you're in the midst of a process like this. So people's jobs can be very, very unstable. And then finally, there's just the kind of cash aspect of it. So migrants are required to pay fees to renew that leave to remain. And that is a minimum of £2,600 per adult every 30 months. So in a family with, two working parents, for instance, you're looking at over £5,000 every 2.5 years on top of everything else. So those are kind of some of the underlying issues. I wanted to then say a bit about in terms of the cost of living support that has been introduced, what are people with no recourse entitled to? And I had some trouble with the image for this slide when I was putting it together. And I thought, actually, it's a very simple slide in that very, very little. So most of the types of cost of living support that have been introduced by the government, people who have no recourse to public funds can't access. So again, they're subject to those same price rises and cost increases, but they're not able to access that support. The impact, so in the kind of starkest terms, around 8 out of 10 of our service users struggle to feed their children. So there's a bit more of a kind of breakdown here of the types of immigration status people have and what they've had to do. But as you can see, a very significant proportion of all of them, it's impacting their ability to provide food for their children. So a very significant impact indeed. I wanted to say a quick bit about what change is needed. So this is this is the kind of top line information, and there'll be a briefing that will go out, I think, following this workshop that has more detail about this if anyone's interested, including a link to an action you can take if you want to kind of do something about this. So the best and quickest thing that the government could do would be just to abolish this no recourse condition and make everyone entitled to access benefits if they need to. That's not something the government are considering. So the urgent steps that we've asked the government to take are, firstly, to make sure that cost of living support schemes actively include people affected by no recourse. So making the criteria for them simply based on your income rather than on receipt of benefits, because making it dependent on receipt of benefits means there's more hurdles for people to jump through that they can't meet. They have done this recently with free school meals, so it is possible for them to do that if they choose to. We also think that kind of utility suppliers should also have other eligibility criteria for their support schemes, so that, again, receipt of benefits isn't the kind of the key that unlocks everything. We want the government to say that people who are affected by no recourse can access support through their support fund. this means a kind of amending some legislation. But again, this is within their power to do, to say that these funds don't class as public funds and therefore people with no recourse could access them. And then finally, broadly kind of in the system, making sure that any kind of support schemes like this aren't dependent on receipt of benefits for their eligibility criteria. So with those things being done, that would significantly improve the circumstances of people, 1.3 million, who currently are subject to this status. There's a link there in terms of the kind of what you can do about it. So you can email your MP. And I just wanted to quickly say what it actually means for Praxis and the board, because obviously this is what's happening kind of for the charities, service users. Because the situation that people are facing is so extreme, it can be very difficult for people who, you know, obviously if you don't have enough to eat, or you don't have enough money to look ahead and think you'll be able to pay for what your children need, then other things take kind of second priority to that. If your job or your home is very, very insecure, then people spend almost all their time trying to stabilize those things or sustain them. So for instance, for Praxis, where we had lots of group work that happened that was often very therapeutic, so people who were experiencing this kind of issue but had kind of reached a point where they wanted to talk about how it affected them, campaign for change. Some of those groups now are much more focused simply on like the basic welfare of the people within those groups, because that's their primary focus now. So it changes what people are able to do for themselves and what we as a charity are able to do with them. The kind of humanitarian need is obviously critical, but there's a question constantly for the board in terms of our strategic purpose. Do we want to become a food bank? You know, no, we don't. There are brilliant food banks who we work closely with who do great work, but Praxis has a very specific and expert kind of approach and understanding of certain issues, and we don't want to lose that because of the kind of the extreme kind of humanitarian need that we're seeing. So that's kind of one balance we're always trying to find. So supporting people without being pulled into being a different kind of charity than we're set up to be and want to be. And then, as other people have mentioned, just the impact on staff. So if you're the caseworker who is every day dealing with multiple people who don't have enough food, whose children don't have enough food, who are experiencing other kinds of destitution, it's very, very emotionally grueling and hard. Knowing that there are many more people who you can't help, again, is very, very difficult. So there's a kind of, I would say, a very high level of kind of well-being support that we need to be providing and thinking about for staff. And pay is obviously part of that, but as Peter, I think, really rightly said, it's not by any means the only part of that. So clinical supervision is something that Praxis has been offering staff for a long time. And that's really important so that people have a place to take what they're seeing and talk about. So I'd say those are kind of the main issues that we're seeing. I'll stop talking now because I know that's a lot of information, but thanks for listening.
Well, thanks very much for sharing, Connie. Really appreciate that. And we're going to go to questions for all the panelists in a minute, so do put those into the Q&A function. But before we do that, Connie, I think that tension that you were talking about of are our service users in the right place that we can help them, or should we move to giving them another service, is something that a lot of boards will be thinking through.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if you could just talk through some of the factors that you've been considering when you've been thinking about that decision, because I know lots of people will be trying to make sure that they're making the right calls right now.
In terms of kind of preserving the right balance strategically around what we're doing. Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, because I actually think it's something you just sort of always have to be thinking about. Like, I think COVID sort of prompted a lot of changes in how people worked, and that's useful in some ways, I think, because there are alternative ways to support people that everyone had to come up with. But I think it's kind of having the like confidence, I suppose, to hold on to those core strategic purposes and be able to adapt enough to deal with the circumstances that we're in now, but also to stay true to those at the same time. So I think there's a kind of constant balancing act. And then I think the other thing for me is just this focus on systemic change. So I think that's the other thing that's so important is, you know, if we're not doing that, then we're just kind of meeting individual need, but never changing the system that causes that need. So that's the critical thing that, you know, Praxis has invested in quite a lot over the last few years, and is seeing some success with, but will continue to kind of work with people, because helping people is still at the core of what we do, but translating that into something that might change the situations for many people.
Great, thank you. And then I'm going to put a question to all three of you now. So we've talked quite a lot about the impact on staff of the cost of living crisis, which I think is fair because there's something that which trustees have quite a lot of control over. And we talked about pay quite a bit, but a lot of you also mentioned the wellbeing aspect. And I think what Connie was just talking about there with staff having almost vicarious trauma through dealing with so many people who are having such high levels of demand. And I know something that advice services have talked about is, unlike in previous years, they don't have tools that can help them. There is nothing that they can do that can really help the cost of living crisis. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about some of the wellbeing measures that you're putting in place to support staff. And I don't know who would like to go first there.
I'm happy to sort of give it a go. I mean, first of all, and I think Dulcie mentioned this as well, but ways in which we can support our people to understand their finances and manage finances. Now, that's not to say that we all need to become financial advisors, but there's a lot of very good stuff out there about how you manage your basic finances and spread the income that you do have to make it go further. So financial well-being has become part of a wider discussion on well-being. I mean, if you go back into the history of well-being, a lot of it was really about physical health and safety, which of course is a very, very important element, but has extended into these ideas of mental health. But we now also see, and it's talked about as financial well-being, because we know that actually having secure finances and not having financial worries is a very important part of one's general well-being. Now, I think to some degree you might argue is financial well-being really a well-being question, but it is certainly a dimension that, particularly now with the cost of living, is impacting people's mental health for sure. So those are things also I think that we can do as responsible employers, which is to say, all right, how can I provide access or point people to good sources of advice where they do need some financial help and guidance? And we know that many people do struggle to understand things like interest rates. I mean, when we talk about things like, okay, I could give you, you could draw down some of your pay before the end of the month. Well, that may be a good thing short term, but you really worry. But where's that going to lead? Am I going to do that every month? And then, so it's just some of those things can be helpful in the short term, but we have to be very careful how we do those things. I would rather see us doing things like, okay, let's advise and provide sources or access to sources of advice on financial management, but be a little bit careful in not trying to turn ourselves into banks, if you will, and loan people money, which some businesses have certainly done. But as I said, I personally have a little bit of a challenge with, because I think that can lead you into some rather stormy waters if we're not careful.
Great, thank you.
I'll just follow on from that because it's kind of relevant. One of the things Praxis did was improve the employee support option that we had, the sort of programme. So it now via our employee portal, you can get independent advice on housing, debt, elder care, all sorts of things. And that was something that it felt important to do, rather than kind of a more general kind of like well-being, like just how do you feel kind of approach, which is important as well. I'm not saying it's not, but it was important to kind of have those other things too. And then I think flexible working as well. I know there was some kind of a question about it in the chat, and I think one thing with flexible working that I think is really important is that, like, as long as it works, as long as it's obviously legal and works for the charity and the work that you want doing can happen, you can be really imaginative, I think, as an employer. And you can, you know, I think people sometimes can feel quite anxious about permitting type flexible working of different kinds, because it's different, or it might set a precedent, or will everyone want it, or all sorts of things. And I think actually, I think it's fine to kind of obviously have some principles that everyone, you know, works within, but then to say, yeah, we're really open to thinking differently about how you work for us. And that to me seems, and I know for me personally as well, that's a very positive, a sort of a very positive approach an employer can take.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's a lot of caution around flexible working, isn't there? A lot of assumption that the worst will happen, and we have to manage for those sort of red lines.
But I would say this is a really good time for experimentation, right? We're still in my view, in a big learning phase about flexible working. You know, as we've already acknowledged that charities perhaps did more of this in the past, but you know, I talked to so many businesses experimenting with all sorts of things, and we won't always get it right. But the point is that we're in this time of flux and change, and there's more demand and expectation for how we might work in different ways. So we should experiment. We should try different things and see what works, and be prepared to tell our organisation and work with our employees to say we're trying some things, and they may not all work, but we want to learn together, see what works best for the organisation as well as the people we employ.
Right. Dulcie.
Well, talking of experimentation, we did a couple of tangible things of enabling people to have free counselling, which was a scheme partly funded by the council and partly funded through us, which is a tangible thing people can do. But what we've done, now I'm saying it, I'm just like, what were we thinking? But we've basically, post-COVID, when morale was really low and people were tired of working at home, and we'd seen a huge rise in mental health problems,